You remember that night, don't you not, that you were there not in the way that mattered. But I remember it, it's etched into me. The rain was coming down in sheets, a cold, relentless November rain that made everything look blurred and broken from the window of the study. The house was always too warm, stifling. But that night the heat felt like a lie. They were all there, my father behind the mahogany desk like a judge presiding over a court he'd already decided, my mother perched on the edge of the leather armchair, her hands folded so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white, my older brother David leaning against the bookshelf, trying to look casual. But I could see the smug satisfaction in the line of his shoulders, and me standing in the middle of the Persian rug feeling like a specimen under a glass jar. But as I said the words, something clicked in my mind, a memory faint and distant like an old photograph. I reached for the doorknob, it was locked. That was weird, I never locked it during the day. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys. I slid the key into the lock. But it wouldn't turn, it just stopped. I jiggled it. Nothing. I tried the other key, the one for the deadbolt, same thing. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I peered through the window. Next to the door, the curtains were open. And the place was empty, I mean completely empty. My rug, my bookshelf, my little table, all gone. The space was just a hollow shell. I stood there for a full minute, just staring at nothing. My brain couldn't process it. Then I heard the main house's screen door slam. My uncle was standing on his porch, arms crossed. He didn't look angry, he looked smug. "What's going on?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Where's my stuff?" "Your stuff is in storage," he said like he was telling me the time. "A unit over on Elm. You've got 30 days to get it out before they auction it." "What are you talking about? This is my home." Was he corrected me. "Was your home? This is my property. We had a disagreement. I don't want you living here anymore. It's that simple." It wasn't simple, nothing about it was simple. The disagreement was about the main house itself. He wanted to sell it, the whole property, to some developer, wipe away every trace of my grandparents, of my mom. I refused to sign off on anything. I thought I had a right to my opinion. Turns out he thought he had a right to change the locks. "You can't do this," I said, my voice rising. "This is illegal." He just shrugged. "Call the cops, then see what they say," and he turned and went back inside. I did call the cops. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. I explained everything, my voice cracking. I showed them my driver's license with this address. I pointed to where my furniture should be. They listened, then went and talked to my uncle. They came back with that look that "we're sorry, but there's nothing we can do" look. Years ago, I must have been 15, I was hiding in the study reading. When my grandfather was visiting, he and my father were talking. And my grandfather, in his gentle, rambling way, was reminiscing about when he bought the family house, our house. The one I'd been kicked out of. He said something almost an aside. "Of course. We had to structure it through the trust. Because of that old easement, with the Henderson lot, your mother's name had to be on the title, separately, because of her father's will, a technicality. It's a civil matter." One of them said, "You don't have a lease. He's the property owner. He says you were a guest, and guests can be asked to leave." "A guest for 3 years, I practically shouted. "I get my mail here. I pay the electric bill for this cottage." The officer just shook his head. "Y'all have to take it up with the courts. We can't force him to let you back, and I am sorry." They left. I stood in the driveway, in the rain, watching their taillights disappear. The feeling of violation was physical. It was like I'd been punched in the gut. He didn't just throw out my things, he erased me. He made me disappear from my own life with a turn of a key. The powerlessness was the worst part. The law was supposed to protect you from this. But it felt like a wall, and I was on the wrong side of it. I had $4 to $7 in my bank account, no family left to turn to. My friends were all couchsurfing themselves. I spent that first night in the bus station, trying to sleep upright on a plastic chair, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and despair. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my empty home. The next morning, I went to the public library. It was warm and dry, and nobody asked any questions. I found a computer terminal in the back corner, and I started typing illegal eviction, tenant rights, without a lease, locked out by family. The search results were a mess of legal jargon and ads for lawyers I couldn't afford. I felt the panic rising again. This was useless. Then I found a PDF from a local legal aid society, a guide for tenants. I started reading, my eyes scanning the text. It talked about establishing residency, getting mail, paying utilities. It said that even without a lease, you have rights. A landlord, even a relative, can't just throw you out. They have to go through a formal eviction process, a court Order what my uncle did was called a self-help eviction, and it was illegal, a spark of hope. But then the next paragraph, to enforce those rights, you have to sue. That takes money, that takes time I didn't have. I kept digging. I don't even remember what I typed into the search bar. Next, something like how to get your house back if you're locked out. And that's when I saw the term adverse possession. It sounded like something from an old Western. I clicked on it. The definition was dry legal. But as I read, my heart started beating faster. It was about gaining ownership of a property by occupying it. But that wasn't what caught my eye. It was a related concept, mentioned in a footnote: the right of a tenant to reclaim possession if they've been illegally locked out. Really? It was called a right of reentry in some states. If you can get back inside your home, and you can prove you lived there, the police might not be able to remove you. It becomes a civil dispute. You'd be a holdover tenant. But you'd be inside, you'd have a foothold. It was a loophole, a crazy, risky, potentially stupid loophole. But it was the only one I had. The plan formed in my mind, fragile and terrifying. I had to get back, and I spent the next 2 days watching the main house. I learned my uncle's schedule. He left for work at 7:30 sharp. His wife left an hour later. The house would be empty until 3. The guest house had a small high window in the bathroom. I remembered it didn't latch properly. I'd been meaning to fix it. The next morning, I hid behind the big azalea bush at the edge of the property, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched his SUV pull away. I waited another agonizing hour, until my aunt's car left too. The coast was clear. I crept around to the back of the guest house. The bathroom window was just as I remembered. I found a loose brick from the garden border, stood on it, and pushed. The window swung inward with a faint creak. It was a tight squeeze, but I wriggled through, tumbling into the empty bathtub with a thud. I was in. The silence was overwhelming. The air was stale and cold, but it was my air, my floor under my feet. I walked through the single room, running my hand along the walls, where my furniture used to be. This was the first step now. For the hard part, I had to hold it. I went to the front door and unlocked it from the inside, a symbolic gesture. Then I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Around noon, I heard the back door of the main house slam, footsteps on the gravel. It was my aunt. She must have come home for something. I saw her face appear in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you doing in here?" she screeched. "Get out, this is trespassing." "I live here," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "This is my home. You illegally evicted me. I've re-entered. I am not leaving." She sputtered, called me names, threatened to call the police. "Go ahead," I said, "call them." And she did this time. It was a different pair of officers. They listened to my aunt's hysterical story about me breaking in. Then they came to the cottage and listened to me. I was ready. I had my driver's license. I had a stack of mail I'd retrieved from the mailbox, all addressed to me at this address. I had a copy of the electric bill in my name. I explained calmly that I was a resident who had been illegally locked out, and that I had exercised my right to re-enter my home. At the time, it was just background noise. But sitting there on Mark's floor, surrounded by someone else's future, that word echoed technicality, and the other part, her name on the title, separately my grandmother's name, a separate claim. I felt a jolt, like a static shock. It was nothing, probably a dead end, but it was the first thread it had to pull on. The police officers exchanged a look. They went back to their car for a long time. When they came back, the older one addressed my uncle, who had rushed home. "Sir, this is a civil matter. We have evidence of her residency. You can't lock her out. If you want her removed, you'll have to file for an eviction with the courts." The look on my uncle's face was pure, unadulterated rage. He was being told by the police that I had a right to be here. It was the first victory, and it tasted sweeter than anything I could remember. But the war wasn't over. It had just changed battlegrounds now. I was living in an empty room. I had a sleeping bag, a cooler for food, and a single lamp. My uncle and aunt lived 30 feet away, and the hostility was a physical presence, a constant low hum of hatred. They'd turn off the water to the cottage. I'd have to get a court order to turn it back on. They'd park their cars to block my path. I'd document everything. It was a siege. I used the library computer to file the lawsuit myself. Wrongful eviction. I asked the court to quiet title, to recognize that my uncle's actions were so egregious that he shouldn't benefit from them. I asked for ownership of the guest house and the land it sat on. It was a Hail Mary pass. The court date arrived. I wore the only clean clothes I had. My uncle had a lawyer in a sharp suit. I was alone. The judge was a serious-looking woman with glasses. She listened to my uncle's lawyer talk about property rights, about how I was a disruptive guest, about how I had broken in. Then it was my turn. I stood up, my hands were shaking. I laid out the timeline: 3 years of residency, the verbal agreement, the dispute over selling the property, the illegal lock change, the police reports. I'd filed the evidence of my reentry. I talked about the doctrine of adverse possession, not for the ownership claim, but to show the principle that the law protects possession. I argued that his illegal act had severed his right to claim superior title against me, the rightful possessor who had been wronged. The judge listened intently. She asked my uncle's lawyer a few pointed questions. Did you provide a formal notice to vacate? No. Did you file for an eviction with this court? No. You simply changed the locks and disposed of her property. The lawyer stammered. My uncle looked at the floor. The judge didn't even leave the bench to deliberate. She said the facts were clear. She condemned the self-help eviction in the strongest terms. She said the law exists to prevent exactly this kind of bullying. Then she ruled. She granted me title to the guest house and a parcel of land around it. She said it was the only equitable remedy for the injustice. She ordered my uncle to pay my filing fees and to return my belongings from storage. I walked out of that courtroom into the sunlight. The deed was officially transferred. A month later, I own my home, now not because it was given to me, but because I used the system. I learned the rules better than the bully did. He thought the law was a lock he could use to keep me out. I found out it was also a key. You just have to be desperate enough to look for it. The noise from the floor below was a constant hum. The printing presses ran day and night, and the smell of ink and paper had seeped into the walls, into my clothes. It was the smell of home. For 30 years, this building was everything: the business on the ground floor, our apartment on the top. We ate, slept, and breathed. Harrison's Sons Printing. My father built it. My brother, my sister, and I were supposed to carry it forward. The next morning I went to the public library. It became my new office. I'd get there when the doors opened and stay until they closed. I started with property records. It was all digital, but you had to know how to search. I found the deed to the house. It was in my parents' names, just as I expected. But I kept digging. I looked up the history of the trust my grandfather had mentioned. I spent days cross-referencing names, dates, old municipal records. I felt like a detective, a historian of my own. And I did. I was the first one in every morning, and the last one to lock up. I knew every client, every invoice, every squeak in the conveyor belt. I handled the finances, the payroll, the things my siblings found tedious. They were the big ideas people, the visionaries. I was the one who made sure the lights stayed on. The disagreement started small. A client wanted to move into digital marketing. My brother Mark saw dollar signs. He wanted to take out a huge loan, buy all this new equipment, rebrand the whole company. I argued for caution. We were a printing house, a good one. We had a loyal customer base because we did one thing, and we did it well, stretching ourselves thin, risking everything. My father built on a trend. It felt like a betrayal. The arguments got louder. They happened at the dinner table, in the hallway, right on the production floor, in front of the employees. Mark and Sarah said I was stuck in the past, that I was afraid of growth. I said they were reckless, that they were going to burn the whole thing to the ground. Then came the meeting. They called it a board meeting. It was just the three of us in my father's old office. The leather chair behind the desk was empty. None of us had ever dared to sit in it. Mark stood in front of it like a king before his throne. Sarah sat stiffly on the couch. I knew before they even spoke. Mark's voice was cold, formal. He said the partnership was no longer tenable, that my resistance was damaging the company's future. He said that as majority shareholders they had voted I was being removed from my position, effective immediately. The words didn't quite land at first. Removed, it was such a sterile word. Then Sarah added, her voice barely a whisper. And we think it's best if you find another place to live. The apartment upstairs, it's part of the business property now. It wouldn't be appropriate for you to stay. That's when it hit me. They weren't just firing me, they were evicting me from my home, the only home I'd known. For 3 decades, the hum of the presses downstairs suddenly sounded like a taunt. I looked at their faces, my own family, and saw nothing but resolve. The discussion was over. They had already decided I was an employee to be terminated, a tenant to be cleared out. I didn't fight. What was there to say? The betrayal was so complete, so cold. that any protest would have just been noise. I turned and walked out. I went upstairs to the apartment, the same apartment, where we'd all grown up, where I'd cared for our mother when she was sick, where we'd celebrated holidays even after Dad was gone now. It was just a set of rooms I needed to empty. I started packing. It was a mechanical process. Fold a shirt, place it in a box, wrap a frame, holding a faded family photo, bury it under towels. My mind was numb. I was just going through the motions. I opened the bottom drawer of my old desk, the one I'd used for homework as a kid, and now used for sorting business receipts. I was clearing it out, throwing away old checkbooks, dried-up pens, when my fingers brushed against a thick manila envelope tucked all the way at the back. It was brittle with age. I pulled it out. The words on the front were typed on a faded label: Harrison Printing Incorporation, lease agreement. I'd forgotten all about it. This was from before my time, from when my father was young, when he first moved the business into this building. I almost tossed it into the trash pile. It was just ancient history, but something made me stop, a morbid curiosity maybe. I slid the documents out. Downfall. The bitterness was still there, but now it had a direction. It had become fuel. The first pages were the articles of incorporation, standard stuff. I skimmed it. Then I found the commercial lease agreement. It was a long document, dense with legal language. My eyes, trained for decades to spot a misplaced decimal or an incorrect quantity, started scanning the lines. It was a 20-year lease with renewal options. My father's name was there, of course, John Harrison, tenant. But then I saw it down in the section about successors, and assigns a clause buried in a paragraph about what happened if the original tenant could no longer fulfill the lease. It stated that in the event of incapacitation or death, the lease would pass to the tenant's next of kin, specifically named, and the name typed right there, next to my father's signature, was mine, William Harrison, not the company, not Harrison Sons, me. My heart started beating a little faster. I read it again. And again. I pulled out the current lease, the one we'd renewed 5 years ago. It was a simpler document, just a basic renewal form. It referenced the original lease. It listed the tenant as Harrison Sons, a family partnership. But that wasn't right according to this original foundational document. The legal tenant of this entire building was my father. And upon his passing, that right transferred directly to me. The business was just an occupant. A sublietor. I spent the rest of the night reading every word. My hands were no longer numb. They were steady. The shock of the firing was replaced by a cold, focused clarity. They thought they held all the power, but they were wrong. They had the business, but I had the ground it stood on. The next morning I didn't call my family. I called a lawyer. I brought him the documents. He spent an hour with them, his expression growing more and more interested. He confirmed it. The lease was ironclad. The original agreement was the controlling document, and its terms were clear. I was the sole leaseholder. The family partnership had no legal standing regarding the property itself. They were operating there at my sufferance when they fired me and demanded I leave. They were in fact attempting to evict the legal tenant from his own property. They were the ones trespassing. I let a week pass. I wanted them to feel secure, to have settled into their new roles. I heard them downstairs, laughing, making plans. The new equipment brochures were already on the breakroom table. I walked into the office on a Tuesday afternoon. Mark was in my father's chair finally. They looked up, annoyed. Sarah sighed. William, we thought you'd be gone by now. The new manager needs the apartment. I stayed calm. I placed a copy of the lease agreement on the desk. I am not going anywhere, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. In fact, you are. And then I found it. It was in a scanned copy of my great-grandfather's. Well, a document so old the ink was faded, a clause buried in a paragraph about inheritance and lineal descendants. It stipulated that the property upon passing to his daughter, me, grandmother, would be held in a way that ensured her bloodline had a perpetual undivided interest. It was convoluted, written in the legalese of another century. But the meaning was clear. When my grandmother died, her share didn't just merge into my. Mark laughed, a short, dismissive bark. What are you talking about? This is our building. No, I said, tapping the document. It's not, it's mine. This lease, the one Grandpa signed, it names me as the successor tenant, not the business, me personally. You've been running your company on property that I legally control. The laughter died in his throat. Sarah stood up, her face pale. That can't be right. We've been paying the rent for years. You've been paying me, I said. The checks were made out to the business. But the business wasn't the tenant. I've been allowing you to operate here, but that allowance has been revoked. The confusion on their faces was quickly replaced by anger. Mark started yelling about lawyers, about how I was trying to steal what was rightfully theirs. I let him rant. When he was done, I slid another piece of paper across the desk. It was a letter from my attorney outlining my legal position. You can call your lawyer, I said. But I've already spoken to mine. He's very confident you have a choice. You can buy the lease from me at a price I set, or you can vacate the premises. You have 30 days. The silence that followed was louder than any press. The power in the room had shifted completely. I saw the realization dawn in their eyes. They weren't the bosses anymore, I was. The negotiations were brutal. They tried every tactic: anger, guilt, family sentiment. They brought in their own lawyer who picked apart the documents, but ultimately came to the same conclusion. I held all the cards. I was emotional. I was a businessman finally dealing with a difficult tenant. I gave them my terms: a cash settlement that reflected the true value of the business goodwill, and the disruption of a move, a large sum enough to break them if they paid it, or they could walk away with the business name and the client list, and I would keep the building. They paid. They had to uprooting the business, finding a new location, moving all that heavy equipment. It would have crippled them. The money transferred, the papers were signed. They moved out a month later. The last I saw of them was the back of a moving truck, turning the corner, taking the Harrison Sons printing sign with it. Now I stand in the main floor. It's empty. The presses are gone. The silence is absolute. And for the first time, it's a peaceful silence. The air is clearing, the scent of ink slowly fading in my hand. I hold the deed, not a lease. I used their money to buy the building outright. The bank was happy to facilitate the sale. It's mine, free and clear. Father's estate, because of how the trust was set up to handle that old easement, her share was meant to pass directly to her descendants, to her grandchildren, to me, and to David. I look at the blank walls, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through the big front windows. This space isn't a monument to my father anymore. It's not a prison of other people's expectations. It's a blank page. I have plans, not for a printing company, maybe a bookstore or a workshop, or something entirely new, something that is completely undeniably mine. They thought they were cutting me loose, but they were just cutting me free. They taught me a final brutal lesson about business: always read the fine print, and more importantly, always know exactly what you own. I grew up in a house that had a soul. It wasn't just brick and mortar, it was my grandparents' house. Every floorboard had a story: the big oak tree in the backyard. I remember my grandfather helping me climb it for the first time. The kitchen always smelled of my grandmother's rosemary bread. Even after they were gone, that smell lingered in the walls. It was a happy house, a safe house. When my grandparents passed, the house went to my parents. It just seemed like the natural order of things. They moved in, and for a while it was still our home. But slowly the feeling started to change. The furniture got replaced with newer, sleeker things. The photos on the mantelpiece changed. It started to feel less like my grandparents' home, and more like my parents' showpiece. The arguments started small. They didn't like my choice of major in college. They thought I should be more ambitious, more focused on a corporate career. I wanted to teach. I wanted to work with kids. To them, that wasn't a real career. Then, it was about who I was dating. They thought my partner wasn't from the right kind of family, didn't have the right kind of prospects. They said he was holding me back. The fights got louder, more frequent. It was always about control, about me not living up to their image. They'd say things like, "We only want what's best for you." But it felt like they only wanted what was best for their reputation. The house, the one that used to feel so warm, started to feel like a gilded cage. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every dinner was tense. The final blow came on a Tuesday night. I remember it was raining. We were in the living room, the same room where my grandfather used to read me stories. My mother said something sharp about my partner's job. I finally snapped. I told them they were shallow, that they cared more about appearances than my happiness. My father stood up, his face hard. He pointed a finger at me and said the words, "I'll never forget. This is my house, my roof, my rules. If you can't abide by them, you can get out tonight." There was a silence after he said it. A cold, heavy silence. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to say something to stop him. But she just looked away. That was it. That was the end. I went upstairs to my old room, the room I'd had since I was a little girl. And I packed a single bag. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely zip it shut. I walked back down the stairs, and neither of them said a word. I just walked out the front door into the rain. I got in my car and drove away. I didn't know where I was going. I ended up crashing on my partner's couch. His apartment was tiny, but it was warm, it was safe. But I felt completely untethered. I felt like a ghost. All my anchors were gone, the physical anchor of that house. And the emotional anchor of my family. Even though they were cruel, they were still my family. Now I had nothing. The family had never updated the ownership. They just assumed it was theirs in their rush to simplify, to consolidate their control. They'd overlooked a dormant clause, a technicality. But in law, technicalities are everything. According to this piece of paper, faded and forgotten. In a city archive, I was a one-third owner of that multi-million-dollar property. David owned a third, my parents owned the final third together. They had kicked me out of a house that was in a very real legal sense partly mine. A few days later, I went to see Mrs. Gable. She was my grandmother's oldest friend. She lived in a little cottage on the other side of town. Surrounded by rose bushes, I needed to be near someone who remembered my grandmother, who remembered the house when it was full of love. Mrs. Gable made me tea, and we sat in her sunroom. She didn't ask too many questions, she just let me be. After a while, I told her what happened, about the fight, about being kicked out. She sighed a deep, sad sigh. She said, "Your grandmother, she worried about this. She really did." That caught me off guard. Worried about what? I asked. Mrs. Gable looked out the window for a moment. She loved your mother, of course. But she saw the streak in her, the need for control, the pride. She was afraid that after she was gone, the house would become a thing of status, not a home. She was so worried that your parents would push you out. She used to say you were the only one who truly loved the house, for what it was, not for what it represented. Her words hit me hard. My grandmother had seen this coming. It was like she had left a message for me across the years. Then Mrs. Gable said something else. "You know, she always talked about you having that house one day. She was very specific about it. She even mentioned something she'd left for you, a journal, I think, or a box, something with her final thoughts." A memory flashed in my mind. A small carved wooden box. My grandmother kept it on her dresser. When I was little, she'd sometimes let me look inside. It had old photographs, a locket, and a small leather-bound diary. She told me it was her memory box. She said that, when I was older, I should look through it properly. I'd completely forgotten about it. I drove straight to the storage unit, where my parents had shoved all of my grandparents' things that didn't fit their new decor. It was a grim, dusty place. I found the box labeled "Master Bedroom." And inside, under a pile of old linens, was the carved wooden box. It felt light in my hands. I took it back to the apartment and placed it on the coffee table. I just stared at it for a long time. This felt like my last connection to her. I opened the lid. The smell of cedar and old paper washed over me. There were the photographs, the locket, and there, tucked into a side pocket, was the small brown diary. My hands were trembling as I picked it up. The leather was soft. I opened it to the first page. Her handwriting was so familiar, an elegant looping script. I started to skim through entries about her garden, about my grandfather, about my mother as a child. Then I reached the last few entries. The writing was a little shakier. This was from when she was sick. My heart was pounding. I read the entry, dated just a few weeks before she died. She wrote about the house. She called it her heart's home. She wrote about her fear that my parents would sell it or turn it into something cold. She wrote about me. She said, "My granddaughter has the same spirit as this old house, strong, warm, full of life. She is the future of this family." I have spoken to my lawyer, but I feel I must write this down for her, so she knows my true wishes. The house is to go to my daughter, but only in trust. It is always, always meant to go to my granddaughter. It is her inheritance. It is her home. I have made this clear. I pray my daughter honors this. I didn't celebrate. I printed the documents, my hands steady. For the first time in months, I went to a payphone. I didn't even have a cell phone anymore. I called the number for a lawyer I'd found online. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and she specialized in property and inheritance law. I met her in her small, quiet office 2 days later. I laid it all out for her. She listened, her eyes scanning the documents. She asked a few questions, then leaned back. "It's unorthodox," she said, "and it will be a fight, but..." I turned the page. There was another entry even later. It was shorter, more urgent. "My daughter is already talking about renovations, about modernizing. She doesn't understand. I fear she will push my granddaughter out. I have added a handwritten note to my will papers. A codicil, the lawyer called it, specifies the transfer of the property to my granddaughter upon her 25th birthday. I have signed it, and had it witnessed. It is in the blue folder with the estate documents. I must trust that this will be enough." A handwritten codicil, a formal amendment to her, while I scrambled through the rest of the box. At the very bottom, tucked beneath the diary, was a blue folder. My hands were shaking so much I could barely open it. It was full of legal-looking papers, and their paperclip to the front was a single sheet of paper. It was in my grandmother's handwriting. It was titled Codicil to My Last Will and Testament. It was dated. It was signed by her, and there were two witness signatures at the bottom. It was simple and clear. I, being of sound mind, hereby amend my will. The property at our address is bequeathed to my daughter, my mother's name, on the condition that it shall be held in trust and transferred in its entirety to my granddaughter, my name, on her 25th birthday. This is my final and firm wish. I read it over and over. This wasn't just a diary entry. This was a legal document. It might not have been filed with the court, but it was signed and witnessed. It was her clear, documented intent. The house was always meant to be mine. My parents had known. They had to have known. They had the same blue folder. They had ignored her final wish. They had stolen my home. I didn't know what to do. I called a lawyer, a friend of my partner's. I scanned the document and sent it to him. He called me back an hour later. He said that while a handwritten codicil can be tricky, a properly signed and witnessed one like this had a very strong chance of holding up in court. It proved my grandmother's intent beyond a doubt. He said my parents would have a very hard time fighting it. They would likely face a costly legal battle. They would probably lose, and the moral pressure, it would be immense. I decided to confront them. I didn't want a lawsuit. I wanted them to see what they had done. I went to the house on a Sunday afternoon. They were surprised to see me. My mother tried to act like nothing was wrong. Are you ready to apologize? She asked. I didn't say a word. I just placed the blue folder on the coffee table, open to the codicil. I watched their faces change. My mother's face went pale. My father's turned red with anger. What is this? He demanded. It's Grandma's final wish, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. It's the truth. You've been hiding. The house was never yours to keep from me. It was always meant to be mine. My mother started to cry, not sad tears, but angry ones. That's not a real will, she shouted. This is our house. My father was quieter, more calculating. He read the document carefully. He saw the signatures. He knew what it meant. He looked from the paper to me, and I saw the shame in his eyes, the shame of being caught, the shame of having their greed exposed. I told them what my lawyer had said, that we could fight this in court, and that the world would see how they had betrayed their own mother's dying wish. I told them the local newspaper would probably love a story about a family fighting over an inheritance, about parents who kicked their daughter out of her own home. The threat of scandal hung in the air. They were people who cared deeply about what others thought. It started with my job, always my job, a research grant, not a corporate salary, not a bonus structure. They could understand, just a passion project, something I believed in. It's not a real career, my father said, his voice flat, final. It's a hobby, a financial drain on this family. The words were familiar, a record I'd heard scratched and played my whole life, but that night they had a new, sharper edge. Your interpretation appears to be correct. You have a claim, a strong one. There was a long, terrible silence. My father finally spoke. Well, have our lawyer look at it. But his voice was defeated. They knew they were cornered. A week later, their lawyer contacted mine. They didn't want to fight. They agreed to sign the property over to me. They just wanted it to be quiet, to be done. The day we signed the papers at the title company, they wouldn't even look at me. They signed their names and walked out without a word. I sat there for a minute. After they left, the house was mine. It was legally, finally mine. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a correction, a justice that was 20 years too late. I went back to the house alone. I used my new key to open the front door. It was quiet, empty. I walked through the rooms. I saw my parents' expensive art on the walls, their modern furniture. But underneath it all, I could still feel the bones of my grandparents' home. I went out to the backyard and stood under the oak tree. I put my hand on its rough bark. It was my house now, but it didn't feel like a home. Yet the victory was bittersweet. I had the house, but I had lost my parents. My grandmother's love had protected me even from the grave. Her foresight had given me back my anchor. But her diary had also revealed a painful truth about the people who were supposed to protect me. The house was a gift, but it was also a burden, a reminder of a love that was constant, and a love that was conditional. I had the keys now. I had to figure out how to make it home again, all by myself. I always knew I was different. It wasn't a secret. I kept, not really. It was more like a truth I was slowly unfolding for myself, piece by piece, in the quiet of my own heart. For years, I thought it was something I had to manage to fold up neatly and tuck away. Whenever I walked through the front door of my parents' house, that house with its perfectly manicured lawn, and the always clean smell of lemon polish, it was a beautiful stage set, and we were all actors playing our parts. My part was the good son. The one who didn't cause trouble. The day I decided to stop acting was a Tuesday. I remember the light in the living room was that particular golden color it gets just before sunset. My mother was arranging flowers. In a vase, my father was reading the newspaper. It was so peaceful, so still. And I just broke the silence. I told them. I was gay. The words felt clumsy leaving my mouth. But they were mine. They were the truest thing I had ever said in that room. The silence that followed was louder than anything I'd ever heard. My mother's hands stopped moving among the stems. My father slowly lowered his paper. I watched their faces, hoping for a flicker of understanding, a hint of the love I'd known my whole life. But it wasn't there. Instead, I saw a wall go up. My father's expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. He said it was a phase, a sickness, a choice I was making to spit in the face of everything they'd given me. My mother just cried, asking what she did wrong, what she could have done to prevent this thing from happening to her son. That was the moment the game changed. Evelyn agreed to take the case on contingency, confident we would win. She advised extreme caution. Do not contact them, she warned. If they get wind of this, they'll move to block you. We need to be methodical, perfect. So I played the long game. I got a job, a simple data entry position. I kept my head down. I'd see family updates, sometimes a new car, a charity gala. They were living their lives, utterly oblivious. Their security was their prison. They thought they were safe. They gave me an ultimatum. It was so simple, so clean: deny it, go to therapy, live the life they had planned for me, or leave the house, the family, everything. I looked from one of their faces to the other, this two-person jury that had already reached a verdict. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I couldn't go back into the closet they were holding open for me. The door to my old life was closing, and my only choice was to walk through it. I packed a single bag that night. They didn't try to stop me. They just watched from the doorway as I walked down the path to the sidewalk, into a world that suddenly felt vast and terrifyingly empty. The first few months were a blur of cheap motel rooms and frantic job searches. I felt untethered, like a boat cut loose from its mooring. The anger was there, a hot, sharp thing in my chest. But it was dulled by a deeper, more profound grief. I had lost my family. Nothing could ever change that. I found a small apartment, a studio with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was mine. I built a new life thread by thread. I made friends who became my chosen family, but there was always a hollow space. Question mark at the center of my story. Who was I really, if not the son they had rejected? That question is what led me to the library. One rainy afternoon, I started digging. I wanted to know about my grandparents, about our history. Maybe I was looking for a clue, some genetic predisposition that would explain me to myself, or maybe I was just trying to find a connection to a past that felt more solid than my present. I ordered birth certificates, death certificates. I spent hours squinting at microfiche screens, the green glow, the only light in the quiet room. It was in a faded newspaper announcement of my own birth that I found the first irregularity. My parents' names were there, but the listed address was different from the one I knew as the family home. It was an apartment in a part of town. They had never mentioned a small thing, but it snagged my attention. I kept digging. I found the obituary for my aunt, my father's sister, Alara. She had died in a car accident a few months before I was born. The obituary mentioned she was survived by her husband, but there was no mention of a child. That seemed odd. Everyone said she had wanted children more than anything. A cold, sharp feeling started to prickle at the back of my neck. I went to the city clerk's office, my hands trembling as I filled out a request form. When the clerk handed me my own long-form birth certificate, I had to sit down on a hard plastic bench, right there in the hallway under mother. It listed Alara's name under father. It listed her husband, a man I had never met. My parents, the people who raised me, were listed as informant. I was their son. I was their nephew. They hadn't given birth to me. They had taken me in the world, tilted on its axis all those years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time my father had called me son, it had been a lie, a carefully constructed fiction. But why? The questions screamed in my head. Why keep such a secret? The answer, it turned out, was in a probate file. It took a lawyer to help me get it unsealed. My real mother, Alara, had been wealthy, far wealthier than my uncle and aunt, the people I called mom and dad, had ever been she and her husband, had a will of very specific ironclad. Well, in the event of their deaths, their entire estate, including a large valuable property, very house I had grown up in was to be held in a trust for their child. Me, my uncle and aunt, were named as the guardians, the trustees. Meanwhile, with Evelyn's guidance, I built the case. We tracked down the original trust documents, we got sworn affidavits from experts in historical property law, we mapped the entire chain of title, creating an irrefutable timeline. It took almost a year of quiet, meticulous work. The anger didn't go away, but it transformed. It wasn't a hot rage anymore, it was a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about the house, it was about proving that I wasn't the person they thought I was. Until I reached the age of 25, the house, the investments, everything, it was all supposed to be mine. They knew, they had always known, they hadn't just taken me in out of the goodness of their hearts, they had taken in a fortune. And they had hidden the truth from me, hoping I would never find out. My coming out, it wasn't just a disappointment to them. It was a threat, it was a loose thread that could unravel their entire comfortable life. They kicked me out to protect their secret, to maintain their hold on a life that was never meant to be theirs. The grief I had been carrying transformed. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was a cold, focused rage. This wasn't just rejection. This was theft of my history, my truth, and my future. I found a lawyer, a woman named Sarah, whose eyes hardened with determination. As I laid out the story, she took the case immediately. This, she said, was as clear as it gets. The legal battle was clinical. It happened in quiet rooms, with polished tables filled with the dry rustle of paper and the precise language of the law. We filed the suit. They fought back, of course. Their lawyer argued that they had raised me, loved me, that I was an ungrateful child, trying to punish them for their beliefs. But the documents didn't lie. The will was entered into evidence. The birth certificate, the paper trail, was a damning testament to their deception. The day of the final hearing, I saw them across the courtroom. They looked smaller, stripped of the authority they had always held over me. They wouldn't meet my eyes. When the judge read the ruling, her voice was calm and steady. She upheld the original will in its entirety. The trust was to be dissolved. The assets, including the deed to the house, were to be transferred to me, their rightful owner. She found that my uncle and aunt had acted in bad faith, that their failure to disclose the inheritance was a profound breach of their fiduciary duty. They were given 60 days to vacate the premises. There was no outburst, no dramatic scene, just the sound of the gavel, a final decisive click that echoed in the silent room. Justice, it turns out, is often very quiet. The 60 days passed. The day of the eviction, I stood across the street from the house, my house. It looked the same as it always had, the same rose bushes my mother, me aunt, had planted, the same porch swing. But I was seeing it with new eyes. It was never a symbol of their stability, it was a monument to their lie. A sheriff's car was parked in the driveway. I watched as they carried boxes out to a moving truck. I saw my uncle's slumped shoulders. I saw her face, pale and tight with a fury she couldn't express. They got into their car and drove away without a backward glance. They were erased from the story they had tried to control. I waited until they were gone, until the street was quiet again. Then I walked across the lawn. The grass needed cutting. I stood before the front door, the same door I had walked out of, with a single bag in my hand. I held a new key cut from the original deed that was now filed with the county. It felt heavy, solid. Value wasn't measured in a paycheck. That I could be more strategic, more patient than all of them put together. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was still smelling faintly of lemon polish and emptiness. I walked from room to room, the living room, where I had told them the truth, the kitchen, where we had shared thousands of meals built on a falsehood, my old bedroom, now just an empty box. It wasn't a victory march, it was a reclaiming. With every step I was taking back a piece of myself. They had tried to bury this house. Wasn't just a building, it was my birthright. It was the proof that my identity, the very thing they rejected, was inextricably linked to a truth that was more powerful than their prejudice. They had tried to make me nothing, but the law and the love of a mother I never knew had made me the heir to my own life. I ended up in the master bedroom. I opened the curtains, letting the afternoon light flood in. I looked out at the garden, at the world, from this new old perspective. I didn't know what I would do with the house, sell it, maybe keep it. It didn't matter right then. What mattered was the quiet certainty settling inside me. The past was finally truly mine, and the future for the first time was built entirely on my own terms. I was home. The freedom was everything I'd ever wanted, waking up to the sound of the ocean one week, and the mountains the next. My laptop was my office, and the world was my well, you know the saying. But every ship needs a home port for me. That was the old house on Elm Street. It was my anchor, my permanent address, the place where my driver's license said I lived, even if I was only physically there a few months out of the year. I paid my share of the mortgage automatically, every month, a digital transaction that felt like sending a piece of myself back home. I paid the internet bill, the utility bill. It was my way of keeping a seat at the table, even from thousands of miles away. The calls home became less frequent. At first it was just the time difference. I'd be finishing up my workday in Lisbon, as my family was just waking up in Illinois. I'd miss the window. Then the texts started getting shorter. Everything's fine, don't worry about us. I thought it was just the natural drift of a life lived on the move. I sent photos of my adventures, thinking I was sharing the joy. I didn't realize they might have been seen as postcards from a life that had left them behind. Email arrived on a Tuesday morning in Bali. The subject line was starkly professional: Ray property at 1842 Elm Street. I assumed it was some kind of marketing thing. But when I opened it, the words didn't make sense. It was from a man named Robert, and he was asking about my timeline for collecting the remaining personal effects from the storage unit. He wrote that he hoped the transition was going smoothly for me, and that he was looking forward to finally moving into his new home. My home. My hands went cold. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers slipping on the screen. I called my mother. It went straight to voicemail. I called my brother. Same thing, a cold hard knot tightened in my stomach. I tried to log into the family bank account we used for the house payments. Password invalid. I tried the utility company's website. Access denied. My digital tether to that house, to my entire life, had been severed with a few clicks. I was sitting in paradise, completely unmoored. The betrayal wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical void. They had waited until I was at my most distant, my most vulnerable, to pull the floor out from under me. They had sold my anchor and left me adrift. The perfect moment came when they decided to refinance the property. They were taking out a huge loan against the equity to fund a new business venture. For David, their application would require a clear title. It was the vulnerability we'd been waiting for. The panic was a live wire. I couldn't breathe. But then something else kicked in, a cold, sharp clarity. This was my world, the digital world. They might have changed the locks on the physical house, but they couldn't erase my footprint. My entire life was documented in ones and zeros, and that was going to be my salvation. I opened my laptop. This wasn't a screen for adventure anymore. It was a command center. First, the financials. I logged into my personal bank, the one they had no access to. I went through 12 months of statements there. They were dozens of automated transfers to the joint account for the mortgage. Each one was a time-stamped bullet point, proving my contribution. I downloaded the PDFs, labeling each one meticulously. Then the utilities. I couldn't log in, but my email was a treasure trove. I searched for utility bill, and the name of the company. Month after month of PDF invoices, sent directly to my email address, all listing 1842 Elm Street, all addressed to me. I had them all. I searched for property tax bingo emails from the county, acknowledgments of payments I'd made from right here, this laptop, to the local government for that specific property. I went deeper. My cloud storage. I searched for photos and videos by location data. There were hundreds. Me on the porch last Christmas, a video tour I'd done for a friend of the renovations I'd paid for in the kitchen, timestamped from just 3 months ago. There were scanned copies of my mail, my tax returns, which listed that address, my voter registration confirmation. Every piece of it was a digital thread tying me irrevocably to that house. Then the most damning evidence of all, the digital paper trail of their own acknowledgments. I searched my message history with my brother there. It was him thanking me for the mortgage transfer this month. Another, where he's asking if I can cover the roof repair invoice and help pay me back. My mother's emails asking when I'd be coming home and telling me to let her know my plans, so she doesn't worry. Every single one of those messages, now saved and backed up in multiple locations, was an admission they knew I lived there. They knew I paid for it. They had built the case for me with their own words. I found a lawyer back home specializing in property law. Our first consultation was over a video call. My face lit by the blue glow of the screen, in a Balinese bungalow, his face in a polished office, a world away. I shared my screen and walked him through the evidence, the bank statements, the utility bills, the photos, the message logs. I watched his expression change from professional skepticism to sheer astonishment. He said he had never seen such a comprehensive, well-organized digital dossier. He said they didn't just make a mistake, they committed fraud, and you have the evidence to prove it. The legal process was agonizingly slow, all handled remotely, documents, signed with digital signatures, court filings, submitted electronically. But my evidence was unassailable. Their lawyer tried to argue I was a mere visitor, a sporadic guest. But you can't argue with 12 months of mortgage payments. You can't argue with utility bills in my name. You can't argue with a video of me inside the house dated after they claimed I had abandoned it. The ruling came in an email from my lawyer. The subject line was simply judgment. My hand shook. As I clicked it, the sale was voided. The court recognized my financial interest and legal residency. The property was to be returned to the estate, and my family was ordered to either buy out my share at a fair market value plus damages, or sign the deed over to me entirely as compensation for the fraudulent sale and emotional distress. The day the legal papers were served, Evelyn called me. It's done. She said. I was at my desk at my boring, quiet job. I thanked her and hung up, and I just sat there. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet. I thought about the shock on their faces, the confusion, the panic. In the end, they couldn't afford to buy me out. The deed to the house on Elm Street was transferred solely into my name. I own it now, free and clear. The anchor is mine. But the chain has been permanently severed. I learned that home isn't just a place you come from, it's something you have to protect. And in this world, the best armor isn't made of bricks and mortar, it's made of data. It's the unerasable, time-stamped, undeniable truth of a digital life. Meticulously lived. I still travel the world is still my office. But now I have a fortress of evidence, and the title to a house that proved my family was never really my home. We met in a mediation room. A week later, the atmosphere was like ice. My father looked older, his face pale, with a fury he couldn't articulate. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. David just stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Their lawyer sputtered, threatened, tried to argue that the claim was frivolous. But Evelyn was a stone wall. She presented the evidence document by document in a calm, dispassionate voice. She explained the law. She showed them the clause. She revealed the title search that proved their ownership was flawed. My father finally spoke, his voice low and strained. This is nonsense. Well, tie this up in court. For years, y'all get nothing. It was a bluff. And we all knew it. The bank had already frozen their loan. Their venture was collapsing before it began. Then I spoke for the first time. You want tie it up? I said. My voice was calm. It didn't even sound like me, because I am not asking for the house. I am not asking to move back in. I let that hang in the air. I saw the confusion on their faces. I am exercising my ownership rights, which means you have two choices. You can buy out my share at the current market value, or I force a partition sale. We sell the house. The proceeds get split 3 ways. It escalated from my career to my life. My choices, the small apartment I rented, the friends I kept, it was an audit of my entire existence. And the conclusion was per-written. You need to learn real responsibility. David chimed in, not even looking at me. You can't just float through life on the family's goodwill. Goodwill, that's what they called it, as if love was a line of credit they could revoke when the balance got too high. The color drained from my father's face. A partition sale would be a public humiliation. It would mean losing the family home, the symbol of their success. They had to choose between their money and their pride, and I knew which one would win. The negotiation was brutal and quick. They agreed to buy me out. The number was substantial, life-changing. When the final papers were signed and the wire transfer hit my account, Evelyn handed me a copy of the new deed. It was a document that now formally listed me as a former owner. My interest extinguished upon sale. But it was a record. It was proof. I held that piece of paper. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like it held the weight of everything. It wasn't about the money. It was the deed with my name on it. A legal fact, an undeniable truth they could not erase. It was vindication. I had used their own world contracts, money leverage against them. I had played by their rules, and I had won. I walked out of that building, and for the first time since that rainy night, I felt solid. I had rebuilt my own foundation, and it was made of something much stronger than their conditional love. It was made of truth. For 10 years my life was measured out in medicine doses and doctor's appointments. It wasn't a life I had chosen so much as one that had chosen me. I was the one who lived closest to Mom, the one without a demanding family of my own, at the time the obvious choice, and I said yes, of course I said yes. The exhaustion wasn't something you could ever really explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It was the kind of tired that seeped into your bones, waking up at 3 in the morning to the sound of her coughing. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety about her next fall, her next infection, her next moment of confusion. I gave up the promotion at work. Because it required travel. First, it was a temporary leave. Then it became permanent. My friends slowly drifted away, their invitations to dinners and weekends dwindling, because I could never commit, I could never be fully present. My own dreams, the idea of maybe finding someone, having a life, they just got folded up and put in a drawer. I told myself there would be time for all that later. My siblings, they lived their lives, they sent flowers on her birthday and called on Sundays. Their voices were always so cheerful on the phone. How's our girl, they'd ask. And I'd give them the update, the medical shorthand. They understood. They'd promised to visit more, to give me a weekend off. Well, come next month, we swear, they'd say. And sometimes they did for a day. They'd breeze in, fill the house with noise and store-bought meals, tell Mom she looked great, and then breeze out again, leaving a quiet that felt heavier than before. And always there was their subtle criticism. Are you sure she needs that medication? It makes her so drowsy. Or the house seems a bit cluttered. Don't you think it can't be good for her mood? They were managing the manager from a distance, free to have opinions without any of the responsibility. But Mom knew in her clearer moments, when the pain wasn't clouding her eyes, she'd reach for my hand. Her skin was so thin like paper, she'd squeeze my fingers. And her voice would be a whisper. I don't know what I would do without you. She'd say, you've put your whole life on hold for me. I see it, I see the sacrifice. And once, about 5 years, and she was particularly lucid, after a good day we were sitting in the garden, and she looked at the house, our family home, this house. She said, her gaze steady, it should be yours. The final blow was colder than the rain outside. My father stood up. We've decided it's time. You made your own way, completely. The allowance stops, the use of the family name for your endeavors stops. And you will find other living arrangements effective immediately. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an eviction from the family. Not just the house. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to say something, anything. She just looked down at her hands. That silence was the coldest thing of all. It was the sound of conditional love. When I'm gone, it's the only way I can think of to thank you, to make sure you're taken care of after all this. I shushed her, told her not to talk like that. But she was adamant. I mean it. She said, I'm going to make sure of it. I tucked that conversation away, a small warm ember in the cold landscape of my life. It wasn't about the house, not really. It was about the acknowledgement. It was her way of saying she saw me. Then she was gone. It was peaceful in the end. I was holding her hand. The silence in the house after was a physical presence. It was a silence I had earned, a silence of pure bone-deep exhaustion, mixed with a grief so profound I couldn't even cry. I was numb. I moved through the motions of calling the funeral home, notifying family, my body operating on a decade of autopilot. They arrived within hours. My brother David with his lawyer's posture, my sister Sarah with her tearful hugs that felt more like an inspection. They took over. The quiet, sacred space of my grief was suddenly filled with their efficient noise. They started talking about the estate and next steps before Mom was even in the ground. I was too tired to protest. It was the day after the funeral. We were in the living room, the same room where Mom had taken her last breath. I was still wearing the same clothes. David cleared his throat. We need to talk about the house, he said. Sarah nodded, not meeting my eyes. I assumed it was about the will, about probate. I was so naive. It's time for you to start thinking about moving on, David said, his voice smooth, practiced. I didn't understand. I just stared at him. This was my home, I whispered. For 10 years I cared for her here. And we're all grateful for that, Sarah chimed in, her voice syrupy. Truly, you were a saint. But this was Mom's house. It's an inheritance. It belongs to all of us equally. The words didn't make sense. They hovered in the air like a bad smell. Equally, I finally managed to say, I lived here. I maintained it. I paid the bills with the money she had. I wiped her brow and held her hand while you two were living your lives. David's face hardened. You were doing your duty, a child's duty, that doesn't entitle you to a greater share. You were a guest here, caring for our mother. And frankly, you've overstayed your welcome. The house needs to be sold, the proceeds split 3 ways. A guest, the word was a slap. A guest who changed soiled sheets, a guest who spent sleepless nights listening for a cry of pain. The rage that rose in me was so hot, so sudden. I thought I would vomit. I argued, my voice trembling with a decade of sacrificed years. I mentioned Mom's wishes, the promises she had made. And the conditions had not been met. David just dismissed it. Mom was ill. She wasn't always thinking clearly. You know that those were just the ramblings of a sick old woman. He said it so casually, so cruelly, erasing her gratitude, her intention. With a single sentence, they presented a united front, a wall of cold legalistic logic, against my raw grieving emotion. They gave me a week, 1 week, to pack up a decade of my life and get out. They said it was for the best, to help me move on. They were evicting me from my own life, from the only home I had, and framing it as an act of kindness. The days that followed were a blur of packing and despair. I felt like a ghost in the house. Every room was a memory, not just of Mom, but of the life I had poured into these walls. I was packing my own life into cardboard boxes, and the future was a terrifying empty space. On the last day, as I was cleaning out the spare room closet, the one filled with old photo albums and Mom's things we never got around to sorting, I found it, a large flat cardboard box tucked right at the back behind winter coats. Inside were old Christmas decorations, but nestled among the tinsel was a large manila envelope. It was thicker, newer than the rest. My heart started to beat a little faster. I opened it. Inside was a document. It was a will, a newer one dated just 2 years ago, long after the one my siblings had produced, and next to it, a letter in my mother's unmistakable shaky hand. I sat on the floor of that dusty closet and read. The will was clear, precise. It stated in unambiguous legal language that in gratitude for the care, companionship, and sacrifice of her child, the undersigned bequeathed the entire property, the house and land, solely to me. It was signed, witnessed, notarized. Everything was in order. The letter was even more powerful. My dearest, it began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found this because they have tried to take what is rightfully yours. Do not let them, David and Sarah, have their own lives, their own security. They have not been here. They have not seen the cost of this love. This house is yours. It is my final thank you. Fight for it. Be strong. I love you. I held those papers, and I wept. I wept for the mother who had seen me, who had tried to protect me. I wept with a fury so pure it felt like fire. They had known. They had found this will after she died, and they had hidden it. They had chosen greed over their own sibling, over their mother's dying wish. That flicker of hope I felt wasn't just about the house. It was a spark of my mother's love, a validation of every single difficult day. I didn't pack another box. I took the envelope. I went to my old room, and I started making phone calls. I found a lawyer, a fierce woman who specialized in probate litigation. She listened to my story, looked at the documents, and her eyes narrowed. This is a clear case of fraud and undue influence, she said. Theirs, not yours. We're going to court. The legal battle was ugly. It dragged on for months. My siblings, confronted with the new will, didn't back down. They accused me of forging it. They claimed I had manipulated Mom in her final days, that I had isolated her from them. They painted me as a scheming caretaker, a bully, who had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman. Hearing them say those things under oath in a cold courtroom was a betrayal deeper than the first. They were willing to destroy my character, to spit on our mother's memory for a share of a house they never cared about, until it held monetary value. I didn't pack much, a single duffel bag. What do you take when you're being exiled? They stood in the grand foyer, a united front. As I walked out into the rain, the door closed behind me with a solid, heavy thud that sounded like forever. I remember standing on the driveway, the water soaking through my jacket, and the feeling wasn't just anger or sadness. It was a complete unraveling. The world I knew, the foundation I'd stood on, however shaky, was gone. I was just untethered. But the truth has a weight to it. My lawyer was brilliant. She presented a timeline of my sacrifice against their absence. She showed bank statements, the small transfers from my account to cover household bills. She found the witnesses who had signed the will, upstanding members of the community, who testified to my mother's sound mind. That day the judge saw it. He saw the stark contrast between a decade of devotion and a few days of deceit. The ruling came down. The hidden will was validated. The probate court found in my favor entirely. The house was mine. The look on my siblings' faces was not of sadness, but of pure, furious defeat. They didn't speak to me. They just stood up and walked out of the courtroom. I never heard from them again. I moved back into the house. The deed arrived in the mail a few weeks later. My name, sole owner. I held that piece of paper, and I walked through the empty rooms. It was a victory. But it tasted like ash. The silence was different now. It wasn't just the silence of Mom's absence. It was the silence of a family irrevocably broken. This house filled with so many memories of love and care was now also a monument to the worst kind of betrayal. I had won, I had my home. But the cost was everything else. The price was the family I thought I had, and the naive belief that sacrifice and love would in the end be honored. Justice was served, but it's a cold companion in a house that echoes with ghosts. The house always felt more like a museum than a home, a place where everything had its specific rigid place, and any deviation was a mark of disrespect. My father wasn't a man of many words, but his silence was a language. I learned to speak fluently. It was a language of disapproval, of constant unspoken measurement, and I always seemed to fall short. Our arguments were never loud dramatic fights. They were cold, tense standoffs. He'd lay down a rule, an expectation that felt arbitrary and suffocating, and I'd push back. It was a slow, grinding erosion of any warmth that might have existed between us. He wanted a certain kind of life for me, a path he had mapped out with precision, a safe career, a respectable marriage, a quiet existence within the boundaries he deemed acceptable. I wanted more. I wanted to make my own mistakes, to find my own way. Him, that wasn't ambition, it was rebellion. The final straw was smaller than you'd think. It wasn't some grand cinematic blow-up. I had decided to take a job in another state, a good opportunity, but in a field he considered unstable, frivolous. I told him over dinner. The clinking of his fork against the plate was the only sound for a long time. He finally looked up, and his eyes weren't angry, they were disappointed. And that was so much worse, he said. If I walked out that door to pursue this, I shouldn't bother coming back. That this house, his support, his name were for someone who understood the meaning of family duty. He presented it as the ultimate choice, his way or no way at all. I remember staring at him, waiting for something to crack, for some hint that this was a test, a bluff. But there was nothing, just that cold, impenetrable wall. So I made my choice. I told him I couldn't live my life trying to earn a love that felt conditional. I left that night with 2 suitcases, believing with every fiber of my being that his need for control was greater than his desire for a son. The door didn't slam, it clicked shut behind me, a quiet final sound. The first few months were a blur of couches and cheap motels. A friend from university let me crash in his spare room, which was really just a glorified storage closet. With a fold-out bed, I'd lie there at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city sounds. And the bitterness was like a poison in my veins. Every article about my family's latest business success, every social media post of them on vacation, felt like a deliberate twist of the knife. They had erased me, and the world just kept turning. The years that followed were mine. I built a life. It was messy and uncertain at times, but it was authentic. The contact was minimal, a birthday card here, a brief stilted phone call there. We were like distant acquaintances bound by a history we both chose to ignore. I convinced myself I was better off, that the freedom was worth the emptiness. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It was my aunt, his sister. Her voice was clipped, formal. "Your father has passed," she said, just like that. A heart attack, sudden. There were arrangements to be made. I felt a numbness, a strange hollow feeling, not quite grief, but the absence of something, the absence of a chance for anything to ever be different. Returning to that house for the funeral was like stepping into a ghost. The air was thick with a silence. He was no longer there to maintain. The relatives were all there, his sisters, their families. Their looks were a mixture of pity and thinly veiled judgment. I could hear the unspoken words. The prodigal son returns too little, too late. They'd all stayed, they'd all played by his rules. And I was the one who had broken them. I felt like an outsider in my own father's home, a stranger at his funeral. The reading of the will was held in his study, the room that had always been his sanctuary, a place I was rarely allowed to enter. The lawyer, a stern-faced man who had known my father for decades, read the document in a monotone voice. The estate was substantial, the house, his investments. It was all divided neatly among his sisters, their children. My name wasn't mentioned. Not once. I just sat there listening, feeling a strange sense of validation. This was the final proof. I had been written out exactly as he'd promised. And then the lawyer cleared his throat. There is, however, a codicil, a separate instruction, pertaining specifically to. He looked down at the paper, then directly at me, to my son. The room went still. Every eye was on me. The lawyer continued. The bequest is conditional. He has left you no monetary assets directly. Instead, you are given sole access to this house for a period of 7 to 2 hours starting now. During that time, if you can locate the item referred to as the foundation, and understand its significance, full ownership of the property, and its remaining contents will be transferred to you if you cannot, or if you choose not to attempt, the house will be sold, and the proceeds added. The main estate. A wave of quiet murmuring went through the room. My aunt leaned over, her voice a harsh whisper. Don't humiliate yourself. It's another one of his games, a final insult. He's making you jump through hoops for a house. He never intended you to have. The others nodded in agreement. It felt logical, a cruel petty power play from beyond the grave. My first instinct was to walk away, to give them all the satisfaction of seeing me refuse to play his game. But something stopped me. It wasn't hope, it was a stubbornness, a need for answers. If this was his last move, I wanted to see it through. I told the lawyer I would stay. I was battling this all-consuming need for revenge. But I had nothing, no money, no leverage, no power, just this burning, useless anger. The first day was frustrating. I wandered through the cold, empty rooms. The foundation. What did that even mean? The basement, the literal foundation of the house. I spent hours down there, running my hands over the cold gray concrete, looking for a loose block, a hidden compartment. Nothing. It felt futile. Maybe my aunt was right. On the second day, I started looking elsewhere. I went into his bedroom, a place that felt like a violation to enter. It was Spartan, orderly, but in his nightstand drawer, tucked under a stack of handkerchiefs, was a key, a small, old-fashioned key. It didn't look like it belonged to any lock in the house. And with it, a slip of paper with a single word written in his precise handwriting. Inception. Inception, the beginning, the foundation. It had to be connected. I thought about the beginning of this house, of our life. Here we moved in. When I was 5, my mind drifted to my old room. I hadn't set foot in it. Since I returned, I pushed the door open. It was a guest room, now sterile and impersonal. But the closet was the same, and there, carved into the wooden frame inside the closet, near the floor, was a tiny date, the month and year we moved in. Next to it, a sequence of numbers. 102,105, my 10th birthday. My heart started to pound. This was it, a combination. I rushed back to his study. There was a large, heavy filing cabinet in the corner. I'd never given it a second thought. I tried the key from his nightstand on the central lock. It turned smoothly. The drawer was full of hanging files. But at the very back, behind all the folders, was a small, sturdy metal box. A fireproof lockbox. The combination lock on the front felt cold under my fingers. 102,105. I took a breath and spun the dial. The lock clicked open. Inside the box there were no stacks of money or jewelry. There was a thick leather-bound journal, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. My hands were trembling as I lifted them out. I sat down in his old chair and opened the journal. The writing wasn't the dry, factual script I associated with him. It was fluid, sometimes messy, filled with emotion. The early entries were about me, his fears, his hopes. When I was born, he wrote about wanting to protect me, to build a fortress around me. Then the entries changed. They started mentioning his business partner, a man named Robert, my uncle by marriage. He wrote about suspicions, about discrepancies in the accounts, about Robert's growing greed and influence. He detailed a plan. Robert had a hostile takeover that would have left our family financially ruined. The letters were copies of legal documents he had secretly sent to his lawyer, letters contesting Robert's actions, building a case against him. And the final few entries, they were a confession. He wrote that he saw only one way to protect me. Robert was vindictive. If he couldn't get to my father, he would have gone after me, used me as leverage, or dragged me into the conflict. The only way to shield me was to push me away, to make me so independent, so separate from him and his world that I would be in. The shift happened on a Tuesday. It was such an ordinary day. My friend, Mark, the one I was staying with, was trying to finalize the purchase of a small condo. He was overwhelmed by the paperwork, the mortgage agreement, the title, all this dense legal language. He asked me to look over it with him, knowing I had a better eye for detail. We were spread out on his living room floor, surrounded by paper. And I was explaining the difference between joint tenancy and tenancy in common. It was a dry, technical point. Unattractive target. I have to make him strong, he wrote. I have to make him hate me enough to leave, to build his own life far from this poison. The last entry was dated just a week before he died. The legal battle is finally over. I won. The asset is secure. But the cost is my son. I see his life from a distance. And he is strong. He is everything I hoped he would be. But he will never know it was the plan. This house, it was always meant for him. It is the foundation of the life I wanted to give him now. It is the foundation he will build upon without the shadows that chased me. I have left him a path to find it. I pray he has the courage to follow it. Under the journal was a single legal document. It was a new deed for the house. The owner's name was mine. The execution date was recent from after our last stilted phone call. He had already given it to me. This search was to earn it, it was to understand it. The revelation didn't bring a sudden warmth, it was a devastating, profound shock. Every harsh word, every cold dismissal, every moment of feeling unloved and unwanted. It had been a performance, a brutal, painful performance. Meant to save me, he hadn't been trying to control my life. He had been trying to give me one. The expulsion wasn't a rejection. It was a sacrifice. He sacrificed our relationship to protect my future. I sat there for a long time holding that deed. The house was silent, but it no longer felt cold. It felt heavy with his presence, with the weight of a love so fierce and so misguided that it chose to look like cruelty. He was a flawed man. He chose the path of maximum pain for both of us, believing it was the only way. I finally understood the complexity of that sacrifice. He loved me enough to let me go, to let me hate him, if it meant I would be safe and free. I inherited more than a house that day. I inherited the truth about my father, and it was a truth more valuable than any property. It was the foundation he promised, and I was finally standing on it. The rain started just as I got off the bus, a cold, miserable drizzle that seeped right through my jacket. I remember thinking, I just had to make it home, get inside, and I could deal with everything. The fight with my uncle, the screaming match. It would all look different after a hot shower and a night's sleep. That's what I told myself. I turned the corner onto my street, our street, and saw his car in the driveway, my uncle's big stupid SUV. I kept my head down, trudging up the path to the little guest house out back. It wasn't much, just a owner room cottage my grandfather built decades ago. But it was mine. I'd lived there for 3 years, ever since my mom got sick, and I moved back to help. After she passed, my uncle, who inherited the main house, said I could stay. Family looks after family. He said I should have gotten it in writings.